What if everything you've been taught about loneliness is a lie? What if the very thing society tells you to fear, being alone, is actually the doorway to the most profound freedom you'll ever experience? Alan Watts, the philosopher who dared to question everything we take for granted, had a radical understanding of solitude that could transform your entire existence. Most people run from being alone like it's a disease. They fill every moment with noise, with people, with distractions, because somewhere deep down they're terrified of what they might discover in the silence. But Watts saw something different. He saw solitude not as emptiness, but as fullness. Not as isolation, but as integration. You see, we've been conditioned to believe that we are incomplete beings, constantly seeking our other half, desperately trying to merge with someone else to become whole. But what if that's the very belief that keeps us fragmented? What if the search for completion outside ourselves is exactly what prevents us from discovering that we were always already complete? Watts understood that the individual who truly knows how to be alone has discovered something most people spend their entire lives seeking without ever finding: the art of being genuinely present with reality as it is not as they wish it were. The illusion of separateness. From the moment you're born, society begins teaching you that you are separate. Separate from others, separate from nature, separate from the universe itself. This is what Watts called the fundamental illusion that creates all human suffering. We learn to see ourselves as isolated, skin-encapsulated egos, fighting against a hostile world, desperately seeking connection to heal this imagined wound of separation. But here's what most never realize. The very effort to overcome separateness through relationships, through constant social connection, through the endless pursuit of external validation, actually reinforces the illusion. You cannot solve the problem of feeling separate by trying to merge with another person, because that approach assumes the separation is real in the first place. Watts had a profound insight. When you truly learn to be alone, you begin to see through this illusion. In genuine solitude, without the constant mirror of other people's expectations and reactions, you start to experience yourself not as a separate entity, but as an expression of the same fundamental reality that expresses itself as everything else. This is not philosophy. This is direct experience. When you sit in perfect stillness, without trying to become anything other than what you already are, something extraordinary happens. The boundaries between you and not you begin to dissolve. You realize that consciousness is not contained within your skull, but that you are a temporary focal point of an awareness that has no limits. Most people are terrified of this dissolution because they mistake their ego, their collection of thoughts, memories, and social roles, for their true self. They believe that without constant external reinforcement, they will simply disappear. But what Watts discovered, and what you can discover too, is that when the ego relaxes its grip, what emerges is not nothingness, but everything. The person who has learned to be truly alone has learned the secret that mystics have been pointing to for thousands of years. You are not a wave separate from the ocean, frantically trying to connect with other waves. You are the ocean itself, temporarily taking the form of a wave. The art of non-attachment. Now, when Watts spoke of being alone, he wasn't advocating for hermit-like isolation or bitter withdrawal from the world. He was pointing to something much more subtle and powerful. The art of non-attachment. This is the ability to engage fully with life while remaining inwardly free, to love without clinging, to participate without losing yourself. Most people approach relationships from a place of psychological neediness. They unconsciously use other people as mirrors to confirm their identity, as emotional crutches to support their sense of self-worth, as distractions from the anxiety of existence. But this isn't love. It's mutual exploitation disguised as affection. The person who has mastered the art of being alone approaches relationships from a completely different foundation. They don't need others to complete them because they've discovered their own completeness. They don't cling to relationships out of fear because they're comfortable with impermanence. They don't lose themselves in romantic fusion because they maintain a clear sense of their own center. This is what Watts called loving without attachment. It's the ability to appreciate the people in your life without trying to possess them, to enjoy their company without becoming dependent on it, to care deeply while remaining free. It's perhaps the most mature form of love possible, love that enhances rather than diminishes both people involved. But you cannot give what you don't have. You cannot love freely if you're not free. And you cannot be free if you're constantly running from the very solitude that would reveal your freedom to you. The irony is profound. The people who are most comfortable being alone are often the most magnetic in relationships. They have what Watts called effortless presence. They're fully there without trying to get anything from you. They listen without agenda. They respond without reactivity. They love without conditions. This is incredibly rare and incredibly attractive. The wisdom of purposelessness. Here's where Watts gets really radical. He suggested that most of our suffering comes from our obsession with purpose, with meaning, with constantly trying to get somewhere other than where we are. We treat life like a problem to be solved, rather than a dance to be danced. When you're alone, really alone, you're confronted with the question that terrifies most people. What's the point? And here's what Watts discovered. The question itself is the problem. Life doesn't need a point. Existence doesn't require justification. The universe doesn't need your permission to be beautiful. In solitude, you begin to appreciate what Watts called purposelessness. You start to see that the sunset doesn't exist to make you happy, but its existence and your ability to perceive it are both expressions of the same mysterious process. You realize that your thoughts arise and pass away like clouds in the sky of consciousness, and that you don't need to identify with every mental weather pattern. This is incredibly liberating. Most people exhaust themselves trying to manufacture meaning, trying to convince themselves that their lives matter in some cosmic sense. But when you embrace purposelessness, you discover something wonderful. Life becomes playful again. You stop taking yourself so seriously. You begin to move through existence with the lightness of a child at play. The person who has learned to be alone without purpose has learned to be present without agenda. They can sit in a garden and simply appreciate the texture of bark, the quality of light, the sound of wind, without needing these experiences to lead anywhere or mean anything beyond themselves. This doesn't lead to nihilism or depression. Quite the opposite. When you stop demanding that life provide you with meaning, you become available to the inherent meaningfulness that was always already there. When you stop trying to justify your existence, you become free to celebrate it. The flow of natural spontaneity. Watts often spoke about the difference between living naturally and living artificially. Most people, he observed, live in a constant state of internal conflict. They're always trying to control their thoughts, manage their emotions, shape their experiences according to some predetermined ideal. They live like they're editing themselves in real time, constantly producing and directing the movie of their own life. But in genuine solitude, something different becomes possible. Without the need to perform for others, without the constant pressure to maintain a social image, you can begin to discover what Watts called natural spontaneity, the effortless way of being that emerges when you stop trying so hard to be anything in particular. Think about water flowing down a mountainside. It doesn't struggle to find the path of least resistance, it simply follows it. It doesn't fight against obstacles. It flows around them or gradually wears them down. It doesn't try to be water, it simply is water, expressing its nature spontaneously and completely. When you learn to be alone, you begin to flow like water. Your responses become natural rather than calculated. Your words arise from authentic feeling rather than from social programming. Your actions emerge from genuine impulse rather than from neurotic compulsion. This is what Watts meant when he spoke of the wisdom of insecurity. Instead of trying to control every aspect of your experience, you learn to trust the intelligence of the process itself. You realize that the same force that grows your hair and beats your heart is perfectly capable of living your life, if you'll just get out of the way. Most people are afraid of this kind of spontaneity because they've been taught that without constant mental control, they'll do something terrible or embarrassing. But Watts observed something remarkable. When people stop fighting against their own nature, they naturally become more harmonious, not less. They become kinder, more creative, more responsive to the needs of each moment. The person who has learned to be alone has learned to trust themselves completely. They don't need external rules to govern their behavior because they've discovered the internal wisdom that naturally responds appropriately to every situation. The joy of ordinary moments. Perhaps the most beautiful gift of learning to be alone is that it reveals the extraordinary nature of ordinary experience. When you're not constantly seeking stimulation, entertainment, or validation from outside sources, you become available to the subtle magic that surrounds you every moment. Watts had an almost childlike appreciation for the simple fact of existence. He could find profound wonder in the taste of tea, the texture of wood, the play of shadows on a wall. This wasn't because he was easily entertained, but because he had learned to perceive without the filter of constant mental commentary. Most people miss their lives because they're always somewhere else mentally. They're either replaying the past or rehearsing the future, but rarely present to the miracle of what's actually happening right now. Even when they're with other people, they're often thinking about what to say next, rather than listening to what's being said. But in solitude, when there's no one to impress and nothing to achieve, you can finally arrive in the present moment. And what you discover there is astonishing. You realize that existence itself is a kind of ongoing celebration, a continuous display of beauty and complexity that doesn't need your interpretation to be perfect. The sound of rain on the roof becomes music. The movement of air through your lungs becomes meditation. The simple awareness that you are aware becomes a source of quiet joy that needs no external fuel to sustain itself. This is what Watts called the art of living in the present. It's not a technique you practice, it's a natural state that emerges when you stop running from silence. Stop filling every moment with distraction. Stop treating solitude like a problem to be solved. The freedom of not knowing. Here's perhaps the most challenging aspect of Watts's teaching. He suggested that true wisdom begins with admitting that we don't actually know anything for certain. All our beliefs, our identities, our certainties about how life works are just mental constructions, useful perhaps, but ultimately arbitrary. When you're constantly surrounded by others, it's easy to maintain the illusion of knowledge. You can hide behind shared beliefs, collective assumptions, social consensus about reality. But in solitude, these supports fall away, and you're confronted with the raw mystery of existence. Most people find this terrifying. They desperately want to know who they are, what life means, where they're going, what they should do. They cling to philosophies, religions, ideologies, anything that promises to provide solid answers to life's fundamental questions. But Watts invited us to consider a radical possibility. What if not knowing is actually more intelligent than knowing? What if the admission of ignorance opens up possibilities that certainty closes down? What if the willingness to say, "I don't know," is the beginning of real learning? When you're comfortable being alone with uncertainty, you become incredibly flexible. You don't get trapped by your own past decisions because you're not overly attached to being consistent. You don't miss opportunities because you're not imprisoned by preconceptions about how things should unfold. The person who has embraced not knowing moves through life with the curiosity of a scientist and the openness of a child. They're constantly discovering, constantly learning, constantly being surprised by the creativity of existence itself. This doesn't mean becoming passive or indecisive. It means acting from a place of responsive intelligence rather than rigid programming. It means being willing to change your mind when new information becomes available. It means holding your beliefs lightly, like tools that can be used when appropriate and set down when they're no longer useful. The art of letting go. Throughout all of Watts' teaching runs one central theme: the art of letting go. Not letting go as a spiritual practice or disciplined effort, but letting go as a natural consequence of understanding how things actually work. When you truly understand that you cannot control other people, you stop trying to manipulate them and start relating to them as they are. When you truly understand that you cannot control the future, you stop anxiously rehearsing scenarios and start responding creatively to what's actually happening. When you truly understand that you cannot control your own thoughts and emotions, you stop fighting against them and start flowing with them. This is what Watts meant by the wisdom of not forcing. Like a skilled martial artist who uses an opponent's energy rather than fighting against it, the wise person learns to work with the natural flow of life rather than constantly swimming upstream. In solitude, letting go becomes easier because there's less to hold on to. Without the complex web of social expectations, without the need to maintain a consistent identity for others, you can allow yourself to be whatever you actually are in each moment. And what you actually are is constantly changing. Most people resist this changeability because they confuse their identity with their thoughts, emotions, and social roles. They think that if they let go of control, they'll lose themselves. But what Watts discovered is exactly the opposite. When you let go of who you think you are, you discover who you actually are, which is far more vast and creative than any fixed identity could ever be. The person who has learned to let go in solitude carries that same relaxed awareness into all their relationships and activities. They don't cling to outcomes, don't force conversations, don't try to make life conform to their expectations. Instead, they participate fully while remaining inwardly free. Conclusion: the pathless path. So here you are, having followed this exploration of solitude and self-discovery to its end. And perhaps you're wondering, what now? What's the practical application of all this philosophy? Here's what Watts would tell you: there is no path. The very idea that you need to go somewhere, become someone, achieve some state of enlightenment, is part of the problem you're trying to solve. You are already what you're seeking. You always have been. The invitation is simple, though not necessarily easy. Stop running from yourself. Stop filling every moment with noise and distraction. Create space in your life for genuine solitude, not lonely isolation, but spacious presence with what is. Start small. Sit quietly for 10 minutes without any agenda. Walk in nature without your phone. Eat a meal in complete silence. Notice what arises when you're not constantly stimulating yourself or seeking external validation. You might discover that what you've been calling loneliness is actually solitude, and solitude is actually freedom. You might find that the silence you've been avoiding contains more music than all the noise you've been creating. You might realize that the person you've been trying to become already exists, quietly waiting for you to notice. This is not about becoming a hermit or withdrawing from life. It's about developing the inner foundation that allows you to engage with life from a place of wholeness rather than neediness, presence rather than reactivity, love rather than attachment. The greatest gift you can give to others is your own authentic presence. And you cannot give what you don't have. You cannot be present with others if you cannot be present with yourself. You cannot love freely if you're not free. Being alone, in the way Watts understood it, is not about isolation. It's about integration. It's about coming home to yourself so completely that wherever you go, you carry that sense of home with you. It's about discovering that you are not separate from life. You are life temporarily expressing itself as you, and that perhaps is the deepest joy of all, not needing anything to be different than it is, while remaining completely free to dance with whatever arises, not because you have to, not because you should, but because dancing is what you are. The ocean doesn't need to justify being wet. The sun doesn't need permission to shine, and you don't need to earn the right to exist exactly as you are, in this moment, complete and whole and perfectly alone together with everything that is. If this exploration has touched something in you, if it stirred a recognition of truths you've always known but perhaps forgotten, then you're ready. Ready to discover that being alone is not the consolation prize for those who can't find connection. It's the foundation that makes genuine connection possible. The pathless path begins with a single step, the willingness to be nobody in particular, going nowhere special, for no reason other than the pure joy of being alive. And that step is always available, right here, right now, in the infinite space of this eternal moment. Welcome home. If these ideas stirred something deep within you, if you felt the pull toward a more authentic existence, you're not alone in this journey. Subscribe to School of Philosophy and ring the notification bell to join thousands of free thinkers exploring the deepest questions of human existence.